History as it happens, April 20th, 2021. Enter Taliban.
I've concluded that it's time to end America's longest war. It's time for American troops to come home.
Both al-Qaeda and ISIS in Afghanistan remain intent on recovering the ability to attack U.S. targets.
That a few thousand Americans watching over there would make it hard for al-Qaeda and ISIS to reorganize to hit us over here.
When the U.S. exits Afghanistan in September, a nation that's seen little but violence and humanitarian crises since 1979 could face a return to the past, because the U.S. war could end the way it began, with the Taliban in power. As President Biden all but concedes, American military might will not defeat the Taliban. Who are these warriors who may return to power in Kabul? That's next, as we report History as it happens, a podcast from the Washington Times. I'm Martin DeCaro.
The battle is now joined on many fronts. We will not waver. We will not tire. We will not falter. And we will not fail.
After 18 months, our troops will begin to come home.
War in Afghanistan was never meant to be a multi-generational undertaking, and it's time to end the forever war.
Afghanistan isn't a country, and half a year has gone by since it's been a war. For those who are there, Afghanistan is more like a prayer. Those are the opening words of The Hidden War, a remarkable account of the Soviet war in Afghanistan by the late journalist Artyom Borovich. Borovich went to Afghanistan after the Soviet invasion in 1979. He believed in the cause, that it was a civilizing war in a backward country. But after witnessing the final phase of the Soviet withdrawal 10 years later, Borovich wrote, "It's difficult to determine exactly what we managed to teach Afghanistan. We bombed not only the detachment of rebels and their caravans, but our own ideals as well," wrote Borovich. I read his book 12 years ago. The U.S. had been in Afghanistan 8 years by then, and we could already relate to the Soviet debacle in many ways. Feelings of righteousness and unbeatable military might when the tanks first rolled in, displaced by a sense of futility and defeat years later on. In 1989, when the Soviets were on their way out, President George Bush expressed his hope for a post-war Afghanistan, a country where thousands of jihadists had flocked to fight the communists with U.S. backing. And these words might sound familiar by now in the context of the past quarter century of unfulfilled promises.
Our commitment, the commitment of the United States to the people there, will remain, and will remain firm. Both through our bilateral humanitarian aid program and through United Nations efforts to remove the mines and resettle the refugees and help reconstruct the war-torn economy. So we would call upon the Soviet Union to refrain from other forms of interference in Afghan affairs. The Soviet Union has nothing to fear from the establishment of an independent, non-aligned Afghanistan.
About 20 years after Bush spoke those words, former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev was telling President Barack Obama that he had better find a way out of Afghanistan. Gorbachev knew as well as anyone the meaning of quagmire. So here we are today. Afghanistan is still at war, but the Taliban and the U.S.-backed government in Kabul are negotiating a possible power-sharing agreement.
You'd have to be a little crazy not to want a way for U.S. troops to finally end this conflict, leave this conflict. And the American people want that. There's no question, kind of across the political spectrum, that has a lot of support. At the same time, everyone who is invested in Afghanistan is worried about what's going to wait for the country after the troops leave. And none of us have a good answer to what that will be.
That's Johnny Walsh. He's a former State Department diplomat who negotiated with the Taliban in Doha. He served in the Obama and Trump administrations, and he's going to join us in a moment to try to demystify the Taliban, to try to give us a sense of what it would mean for Afghanistan and its neighbors should the group seize power again, as well as what it would mean for the rights of women, among other aims. Because after 20 years, it appears President Biden has no good options left for the United States. Gains on the battlefield and in human rights have been fleeting, and the U.S. was already facing a May 1st deadline to pull out its last troops. So first, we're going to check in with Guy Taylor, the Washington Times national security team leader, for more on the president's decision and the ongoing peace talks. Guy, welcome back.
Hi, Martin.
Let's start with the president's announcement. What prompted this now? Was it the May 1st deadline? And why September?
Well, it's an interesting question on everyone's mind. I think that this was a decision that America and the world knew would be coming. It hung over the Trump administration for 4 years. It hung over the Obama administration before that. Biden wanted to make a decision about staying in or pulling out of Afghanistan before the 100-day mark of his presidency, which comes at the end of the month here. That said, I think we had the May 1 deadline as well that was in the Doha agreement. And we also had this kind of moment came up this week that the administration was well aware of, that NATO was holding a major meeting of both defense secretaries and foreign secretaries. Remember, NATO actually has more troops in Afghanistan right now than the US does. And I think Biden's team thought, let's do it now. Let's make the announcement. Let's coordinate it with NATO so there's no chance of any perception of division between the U.S. and NATO.
And September is also the 20th anniversary of 9/11, right?
You know, every year the 9/11 anniversary comes around, there's a lot of hand-wringing about how long is the United States going to be in Afghanistan? Did it win the war? Is there going to be another year of U.S. forces in Afghanistan? Why were we there to begin with? So I think the Biden administration sees the upcoming anniversary as a chance to maybe not declare victory, but at least try to have some symbolism and say, after a generation of U.S. occupation or participation in this far-off war, that we're finally out of there.
You mentioned the Doha Agreement. That was under the Trump administration, if I'm not mistaken, an agreement between the United States and the Taliban, not necessarily the Afghan government that is supported by the United States. What was the Taliban's reaction to President Biden's announcement?
Yeah, well, the Taliban's reaction was pretty predictable. They formally said that they would boycott any peace talks with the Afghan government. This is a little bit of a complicated issue. The Doha Agreement between the U.S. and the Taliban basically said the U.S. forces would prepare to leave Afghanistan as long as the Taliban began a meaningful peace process and political talks with the U.S.-backed government in Kabul. And what the Taliban has said in response to Biden's announcement this week that the U.S. is moving when U.S. forces would come out is that the Taliban won't participate in those talks. It won't until all foreign forces are out of the country. That was the public line. I think people kind of expected that. It's a lot of bluster. What's interesting then is if you go away from sort of the official spokesman of the Taliban and you go down to the sort of regional and local level commanders, you heard far more incendiary remarks coming out. One commander was quoted as basically saying the Taliban is so angry it's going to create a nightmare for American forces and launch attacks on the U.S. for not getting out of the country by May 1. The BBC had an interview with one shadow Taliban mayor of a district in northern Afghanistan. Is basically saying, we've won the war, America has lost. It's just a matter of time of waiting.
What do you mean by Taliban shadow mayor?
You know, I was actually using the BBC term. I think the idea is that we don't like to talk about it too openly in the U.S. media space, but the reality is the Taliban controls more than half of the territory in Afghanistan. The Council on Foreign Relations did a report that said the Taliban shadow mayors, if we want to call them that, they actually control 19% of the districts across the country. This means that the Afghan government controls more, but that's a significant amount of local and regional government around the country. And then territory-wise, it's actually a lot more than that. It's more than 50%.
Guy, I do want to get into what the president's advisors and intelligence community were telling him about a withdrawal, but let's refresh our memories first. What have the 4,000 or so American troops been doing in Afghanistan? Mostly a support role, right?
So technically, hostilities are supposed to have ended quite a while ago in Afghanistan. What the American troops are doing there is kind of threefold. On one hand, they're engaged in an on-the-ground intelligence gathering operation against Islamic extremist terrorist suspects. Islamic State has a branch in Afghanistan. There's still a significant number of devout al-Qaeda fighters. Al-Qaeda seems like a bygone thing, but when you dig into the intelligence community and the national security communities around the world, Al-Qaeda remains a very viable group that has a presence in Afghanistan to plot attacks, external attacks and whatnot. So the American forces have a really strong intelligence gathering operation to keep an eye on that in the country. Another big part of what U.S. forces are doing is training Afghan forces and backing up Afghan forces. The U.S.-backed government in Kabul oversees a pretty substantial security force, an Afghan military at this point, and the United States has its contingent of advisors there to help make this military be stronger than it actually is. This includes also being there with air support to provide bombing capabilities that the Afghan government and Afghan military doesn't have without the U.S. forces there on the ground.
So the bulk of the fighting is done by the Afghan army and security forces.
That's right.
As far as infantry, on-the-ground infantry fighting.
That's right, and it has been for several years now.
So the U.S. is still training the Afghan military 20 years later. I mean, that's part of the problem here, isn't it?
You know, there's a common idea in the U.S. among observers of these things that somehow there's this banana republic in Afghanistan and these horrible soldiers that can't be trained. But I think if you go out and read testimonials from American commanders and soldiers who've worked with the Afghans forces are actually quite strong, and especially the Afghan special forces. These are like forces that have incurred 10 times as many casualties as U.S. forces over the last 20 years and have had tremendous success. Remember, holding most of, if not all of the major cities in Afghanistan, including Kabul, which used to be held by the Taliban. So these guys aren't a ragtag militia or some pickup truck driving chaotic, untrained militia. This is a serious military, and you're only talking about less than 4,000 U.S. troops on the ground that are actually providing support for them. So, there's a knee-jerk reaction that everybody says, well, the Afghan military is going to tear their uniforms off and run away as soon as the Americans leave. I think that's unrealistic.
So if what you're saying is right, then why do we hear calls immediately as soon as the president came out with his announcement, not just from Republicans in Congress, but reporting on this? You've done it. Intelligence officials telling the administration can't do this, that the Afghan government won't hold up without U.S. help.
Two reasons, I think, Martin. One is that the Taliban actually also is very strong. That Council on Foreign Relations report that I was mentioning also estimated that some 85,000 fighters are in the Taliban. In addition to holding all these districts and territory, the Taliban continues to have support from outside the country as well, inside Pakistan. So the Taliban is strong, and the idea is that there could be a civil war that breaks out, and we'll all watch as the American gains, so to speak, are lost. The other thing that doesn't get talked about quite as much is this geostrategic significance of the U.S. presence. The Americans have been in the country now for 20 years. This is a country that's very close to Russia. It's very close to China. It borders Iran. It borders nuclear-armed Pakistan. It's close to India. It has incredible geostrategic significance. And the United States pulling out means that the United States is leaving what was basically a permanent base outside of Kabul at Bagram. And for what reason? And what are the strategic losses? Sometimes I think we have a hard time in the U.S. media talking openly about the commitments America makes as a leader in global security. The idea is, look, the United States has invested all of this to be the leader, the security leader in South Asia with this presence in Afghanistan, and now that's over. Well, who's going to fill the vacuum? And that's the question, is the devil you know better than the devil you don't? And that's what I think we're heading towards.
But will it really be over? I mean, the United States can pledge to take its final troops out of Afghanistan several months from now, but it can maintain troops in neighboring countries. It still has aircraft carriers, long-range bombers, drones. it can still wage war inside Afghanistan, even without a soldier in the country, right?
It certainly seems that way. I think we're all trying to kind of figure out whether those are statements coming from politically appointed leaders of the Pentagon. The Secretary of Defense, Lloyd Austin, basically made this statement coinciding the administration's announcement this week that the U.S. can pretty much target terrorists anywhere it wants in the world and will continue to be able to. As a seasoned reporter covering this stuff, I think there is accuracy to that. What I do think is that the U.S. will be ceding its leverage over what goes on inside Afghanistan. And what we saw in the years leading up to 9/11, when no outside power wields any leverage in Afghanistan, you have a situation that can give rise to extremist groups that use that place to plot attacks against other countries, which is what al-Qaeda did in Afghanistan before 9/11.
Guy Taylor, Washington Times National Security Team Leader, will talk to you soon. Now let's talk to someone who sat across the negotiating table from the Taliban after the Obama administration secretly initiated peace talks some 10 years ago. Johnny Walsh, a former diplomat at the State Department who now works as a senior expert on Afghanistan at the United States Institute of Peace. Johnny Walsh, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
So let's start with your reaction to President Biden's announcement.
Yeah, I think it is a bittersweet moment for anyone who's really invested in Afghanistan. You'd have to be a little crazy not to want a way for U.S. troops to finally end this conflict, leave this conflict. And the American people want that. There's no question, kind of across the political spectrum, that has a lot of support. At the same time, everyone who is invested in Afghanistan is worried about what's going to wait for the country after the troops leave. And none of us have a good answer to what that will be. For a lot of us, our ultimate perspective on whether it's right to withdraw militarily now will come down to how engaged we stay in the aftermath to kind of prevent the worst outcomes that could come in Afghanistan. You know, there are still a lot of tools that the United States has to, in this case, help broker peace efforts, to help develop the country, to show a benefit to making peace to each side. And those might be make or break in terms of whether we see a real catastrophe in Afghanistan, which is certainly possible, or maybe an outcome that is better than it would have been if troops had just stayed and stayed.
So you use the word invested in Afghanistan. You obviously feel that way because you worked on the peace process.
Yeah, absolutely. I first served in Afghanistan in Kandahar in 2010 and 11, which was really like the height of our troop surge there. It was the most violent place in the world at the time, I'm pretty sure. You come away from an experience like that with a lot of things, including I just absolutely loved Afghanistan and Afghans. It's a great place despite all the suffering it's been through. But I also came away convinced that for all the good things, and there were lots of good things that the U.S. troops and diplomats were doing in that country, we were never going to win it militarily. I could unpack that, but it was really clear, even when we had unlimited resources at the time. So I came back and spent the next 10 years working on the peace process in different capacities because it was the only happy ending that I could even plausibly see for that country and decent outcome for everything the US had invested in it. And like those peace efforts have grown in prominence over time, they might well still succeed in this next chapter Afghanistan is about to experience. And they've come further than at that time would have been imaginable with the parties really talking to each other. But that is how Afghanistan got under my skin and what kind of drove me the last 10 years.
So you were in the State Department in Kandahar, just so our listeners know exactly what you were doing there.
That's right.
So the reason I invited you on was to try to demystify the Taliban for our listeners, but I'd like to ask you one more question about the immediate situation. Under what circumstances might the United States stay past the September 11th date, or even go back into Afghanistan afterward?
I think that President Biden was pretty unequivocal in his statement that we intend to withdraw all troops by September 11th, the 20th anniversary of the September 11th. And I don't see a lot of wiggle room in that. I would say that there have been other deadlines for the withdrawal of troops in the past. There have been many of them, in fact, and successive US presidents have intended to honor them and seen a really bad situation looming on the other side of those dates, which I think is what has repeatedly made them back away from the brink. And I'm not predicting that that's what will happen this time, or I'm not predicting that President Biden will back away from his announcement. That's why it's such a tough decision. That's what's kept us there this long. And so in a worst case scenario, but still a plausible scenario, in the wake of US troops withdrawing, you certainly could see major Taliban gains on the battlefield. You could see the collapse of the state. You could see just a major escalation in what is already the most violent conflict in the world at the moment, by most ways of measuring anyway. And that affects the United States. It's not just a contained, far-off conflict. Certainly, if there's a real humanitarian catastrophe unfolding in Afghanistan at some point, the world is going to look to the United States and say, you were there for 20 years. Aren't you going to do something now? But even in more hard power interests, Afghanistan could it's not a huge terrorist threat right now, frankly, but it could become one again. And there are different pathways that could happen. Afghanistan was already the number 2 contributor to the refugee exodus that upended the politics of Europe for a generation. That could happen again. That level of outflow could happen again. And so that affects the US. It affects our key allies. It's not really something that stays hermetically sealed in the middle of Central Asia. So over time, if we don't stay engaged to avoid these real meltdown scenarios, absolutely, it could be very tempting. It could be very difficult not to be drawn back in militarily. And again, I revert to the peace process as the best or perhaps only chance to avoid some of those bad outcomes.
Well, as you mentioned, the possibility that Afghanistan could become a so-called haven for terrorists again is being used as an argument against leaving the country. Here is Senator Lindsey Graham.
I don't trust the Taliban to look out for American interest, but we're finding ourselves in a very precarious situation.
But if one agrees that the United States can't leave until it's either defeated the Taliban or eliminated the threat of terrorism, that's basically saying the United States has to stay there forever, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think we have erred over time by focusing too much on just a military campaign in what proved to be the kind of misguided notion that we could defeat this enormous insurgency with deep roots in the soil. Now, the United States could defeat that insurgency, but at a cost many times the size of what we invested at the height of this war in 2010-11. No American supports that. So I don't see a path to a better situation that only is about keeping our troops there. And in fact, it says something that we withdrew from 100,000 troops to 2,500 troops. And it's not that there was no change, but there was a lot less change in the battlefield situation than you might expect with a change of that magnitude. What matters is, what are those troops trying to accomplish, and what's our larger policy trying to accomplish? At risk of being a broken record, I would say, like trying to get a political settlement that brings the Taliban into the system, but does not let them dominate it, and thereby protects basic democracy and human rights in Afghanistan. That is a somewhat plausible scenario. One can use military tools to that end. One can use diplomatic tools to that end. But to only try to beat the insurgency, I think, is a mistake that we've hopefully learned from over time.
Well, it seems clear that a military victory is no longer attainable. So finally, to the reason I asked you on the podcast, the Taliban. We often think of the Taliban just as a militia, a fighting group, a group of religious fanatics, an estimated 85,000 soldiers in the field right now. But you were there as a diplomat speaking to the Taliban's representatives at the peace table. I know you can't go over what was discussed, but what were the Taliban like as negotiators?
I mean, the Taliban are a lot of different things. Some of those things are just awful. They are responsible for huge abuses throughout this war. So are other parties, but absolutely they are. They are an extremely hardline religious militia that is reflected in their governance, et cetera, et cetera. At the negotiating table, there are many Talibs who also want to end this war. They are tough negotiators. They drive a hard bargain. They recognize, or they perceive, that time is on their side, in that eventually they have always believed the United States has to leave. And so eventually they could wait us out. That's reflected in how they negotiate. It rebalances some of the power imbalance that would naturally exist between the world's superpower and this kind of local militia, relatively local militia. But as with any movement, they are also humans, and no one likes seeing all this killing. So what I found is, those who put themselves forward within the group to be involved in peace efforts believed in peace. And what that meant to each side, what each side would have to make concessions on, that's hard in any negotiation. But there are also deeply human moments where you look across a huge political chasm and see a counterpart who would like to get this to a better place and to end this war some way other than militarily. So, those can be slender reeds of hope. That does not itself deliver a successful outcome to this or any other negotiation. But it's a key start. And what you want to do is give the people on the other side who feel that way a reason to show success to their larger organization. Same back here. And then maybe the negotiators win out in our respective systems. That's the best outcome.
The Taliban don't seem to have much respect for the Afghan government under President Ashraf Ghani. And isn't that why they wanted to negotiate only with the United States and not with Ghani's government? Correct me if I'm wrong.
No, that's right. It's less about Ghani than about the Afghan government itself, which the Taliban view as fundamentally illegitimate. They continually demean it as an American-backed puppet, as set up illegitimately. Their phrase is under the shadow of the B-52s after 2001. And so they had the same stance under Karzai, the prior Afghan president. It's actually interesting that they've been perfectly fine meeting openly with Ghani when Karzai was president and Karzai when Ghani was president. So it's less the individual than it is, they don't want to grant legitimacy to the institution. Now, the whole rest of the world and the vast majority of Afghanistan already views the Afghan government as the legitimate government, if nothing else. So I'm certainly not taking their side in that debate. That is what made them so reluctant for so many years to talk to that government. And they preferred, and this is common in other conflicts like this, they wanted to talk to the global power who they could define, however inaccurately, as pulling the strings of the Afghan government. And I would say for most of the 10 years I worked on this, that was the single biggest obstacle to getting out of this cycle of endless war. The Taliban wouldn't talk to their fellow countrymen and women. They only wanted to talk to the United States.
So in 2001, most Americans were unfamiliar with the Taliban, didn't really realize this group had won Afghanistan civil war in 1996, a war that had been going on for several years after the Soviet pullout. So let's talk about the origins of the Taliban, because we're on the second or third generation of Taliban. The men that you were negotiating with at the peace table may have been the sons of the Taliban who were raised in religious schools on the Afghanistan-Pakistan border during the 1980s and the 1990s. In short, who are these people?
Yeah, originally it was just a very localized movement around Kandahar. That city in southern Afghanistan is the birthplace of the Taliban. After the Soviets withdrew, down in Kandahar, it had just fallen into sort of competing fiefdoms of local warlords, pretty much all of whom were terrible. And this somewhat obscure low-level cleric named Mullah Omar formed a group and started cleaning up his immediate area, and then Kandahar city, and then the larger south, and then eventually they took Kabul. And the Taliban they had fought in the Soviet war, but not as the Taliban. They were all associated with different factions at that time. So these were battle-hardened guys, and they certainly were all guys as far as I can tell. Many of them, their fighters came out of the refugee camps in Pakistan, of which there were so many as a result of the Soviet war, and really the war that has never entirely ended. And their ranks swelled. They were able to co-opt different tribes, other warlords, even other mujahideen groups at times, and sort of found themselves at the gates of Kabul with fewer fights than they might have expected. And people, this has happened in many countries, people were so hungry for basic security that they welcomed this unknown group despite a version of austere Islam that went well beyond what I'd say the vast majority of Afghans would naturally have gravitated to. So the Taliban are this local southern Pashtun movement in Afghanistan that took power. And it was a double-edged sword once they did. They did provide a degree of stability, a stop to the killing and the crime that had marked the country for so long because they had won. On the other hand, they had this brutal form of justice that the whole world became familiar with. I think the overwhelming majority of Afghans hated that and are pretty clear about that now. And so when the United States came in after 2001, the Taliban had worn out their welcome by then. And it's why there were, in contrast to Iraq, we experienced several years of stability in the first years of our time in Afghanistan because the Taliban had discredited themselves. It's a whole other story about how they came back, but that was their first life cycle.
You know, when I mentioned that you may have been negotiating with the sons of the original Taliban, I was speaking figuratively, but we are talking quarter of a century has passed since they emerged, more than a quarter of a century. How have they changed over time? Have they changed?
They've changed in some ways. In terms of who's in the group, yeah, a lot of sons of the originals are in leadership positions now.
Many of them have died in war fighting.
Yeah, definitely. Now, many of the originals are still very much in power. A lot of the Taliban era cabinet is still at the top of the Taliban hierarchy today, in part because they've all been in Pakistan. That level of leader has been in relative safety in Pakistan all this time. The younger generation, I mean, they mean a lot of different things in different places, but the Taliban have been good at recruiting a seemingly limitless supply of fighters in basically every part of the country who either respond to their very religious message or to their very Afghan nationalist message of resisting foreign occupiers and will never allow ourselves to be dominated by outsiders. That's a treasured Afghan narrative that the Taliban have tapped into. Sometimes it's as simple as economic motives or people who are just exasperated with the government or some abusive local authority of one kind or another. And the Taliban have tapped into all of that. It's why they've been successful in forming this enormous insurgency, despite still not really being popular. You can never find, polling is hard in Afghanistan, but you can never find polling of them having more than like 20% support. And it's dwarfed by the popularity of the Afghan government. And that just shows how they've been able to overcome that very minority level of support they have by being organized and disciplined and recruiting everywhere and managing to keep that small population very fired up for this cause.
As mentioned, there's an estimate that there are 85,000 Taliban soldiers in the field. So you mentioned the demographic changes, for lack of a better term, that the Taliban has undergone. Has their ideology evolved or changed? I think a lot of people are wondering, what is the Taliban's worldview, or what would be the Taliban's approach to governing or foreign policy if they prevail in Afghanistan?
Yeah. This is on some level the million-dollar question when we talk about making peace, because the core questions are like, can they accept democracy? Can they accept basic human rights? And I'd be lying if I had an authoritative answer to that. Anyone who claimed to have an authoritative answer would probably be lying too.
Absolutely. It's fair to say that it's difficult to determine which way this may go.
Yeah, but I won't dodge your question entirely. I'd say their ideology is pretty consistent, but issue by issue, you can see some daylight on different things. So, for example, on the issue of supporting international terrorist groups, I think there's been a lot of change. Broadly speaking, the group recognizes that they lost everything for having supported a group, Al-Qaeda, that brought very little benefit to them then or now. Al-Qaeda is a tiny fraction of the strength of the Taliban. So most Talibs will say, we're not doing that again. And the Taliban themselves have no international ambitions. They have never been involved in an international attack. They are about Afghanistan. On women's issues, the record is still not good in the areas the Taliban control. What they will say, and this could be true in its own way, is that they have evolved a lot since their regime. Now, their regime was probably the most regressive political entity toward women in the world,
That's right.
With few peers, let's say.
Can only go one way from there.
Yeah. So they might stake out positions like, well, now we accept that women should work and be educated and can even hold public office. From their perspective, that might be coming a long way towards how we see women's rights. But they will caveat it with things we'd consider whoppers, like saying a woman can't be president, or schools have to be strictly segregated and there's not always enough money for girls' schools in a small village, or that women shouldn't be on TV except under certain circumstances. Like, those are totally unacceptable, not just to the United States, but to their negotiating partners in Afghanistan. These are hard issues to bridge. And I guess your original question was, have they changed? They have changed some. They've reacted to the times, but they are still an arch conservative movement. And it'll be hard to reconcile their vision of the world with what we would recognize as modern ideology of the Afghan Republic that enjoys the support of most of the rest of the country, as in the overwhelming majority of the country.
I'm holding Ahmed Rashid's book, Taliban, in my hands here. I remember reading this some years ago about how the Taliban really wasn't interested in governing or having government institutions. Has that changed at all?
I think that has changed. I would not say that they are ready to, if they find themselves having won a very unfortunate military victory, I would not describe them as ready to take over the running of an efficient state. And that may be a point of leverage for that matter. Like they are going to need help from the outside in whatever capacity they one day enter government.
And my question assumed that they would prevail in the fighting that might follow an American withdrawal, but that's an assumption that may not happen.
Maybe it will, maybe it won't. They think it will, but they might be wrong. A lot of groups are overconfident. The Mujahideen certainly thought they'd win a quick victory when the Soviets withdrew, and it was way harder and more complex than that. I would say what Rashid's book came out when the Taliban were a regime, and they, in the 90s, they viewed themselves as operating under the most desperate of circumstances with no tools, no ability to do basically anything but fight the war and try and restore basic stability. And so their ministries and their service delivery and all the things that a government's supposed to do were minuscule to non-existent, very, very sparse and mostly ineffective. Today, what has changed is that in the areas they control, they have this very elaborate network of what's often called shadow governance, which is to say they have a shadow governor of every province, most districts. They are involved in the provision of education, judicial services, sometimes even electricity, cell phone services. Sometimes it's an odd hybrid of the Taliban and the government sort of working together in ways to provide the services in tandem or in an uneasy arrangement. So they have bureaucratized since then. That is more sophisticated than they were in the 90s. It's also much less sophisticated than anything we would recognize as a proper government today.
How have the Talibs maintained arms and supplies? Where are they getting all this from to fight the most powerful military in the world?
It's a hard thing to trace, but I'd say contrary to popular belief, they are able to get the overwhelming majority of the money, guns, and fighters that they need from inside Afghanistan. And that is a result of having this core base of support, or at least populations that they can coerce into cooperating with them, into acquiescence on the ground. When you control territory, that represents a base of taxation for everything from certainly the drug trade, which they're sort of notorious for getting money from, but also every other kind of economic activity in areas you control. That's how ISIS operated as well when it was a territory holding caliphate. And weapons too. I mean, Afghanistan is awash in small arms, and the Taliban have fought this war with small arms. Like they're not using highly sophisticated weaponry from the outside. So that base of money, guns, and fighters that they have from inside the country is certainly supplemented by mostly very unhelpful contributions from outside powers. But sometimes when we're looking at Afghanistan, I think we tend to attribute too much of their strength to their relationship with Pakistan, their relationships with Iran or Russia, when in fact, I would assert the overwhelming majority of the strength they can apply comes from this base of territory and a degree of popular support inside the country itself.
Well, you must be reading my mind, because I was going to ask you about the Pakistanis, and as a peace negotiator, whether you believe the Pakistanis should have been at the table too. But it sounds like you're saying it's easy to overstate the Pakistani influence here.
The Talibs are dependent on Pakistan for some things, most notably just the kind of benign neglect they've received for many years to conduct this complex insurgency, with their leadership being based in Pakistan. I would say at the table, I've never had the feeling that Pakistan needed to be in the room. I've more had the feeling that the United States should not be in the room, because the questions that matter are things that Afghans have to resolve themselves. And I don't say that as a wishy-washy matter of high principle. I say it because outside powers can't make these decisions for Afghans and expect them to stick. Afghans are the ones who have to live with this stuff for years and decades after, however this war ends. And so questions like, how's power going to be shared? What's going to happen to all the fighters and prisoners? What's the judicial regimen like? What kind of system will they even live in? The United States or any other power have no ability to just dictate these things and expect Afghans to embrace them and for it to hold.
What's stopping the Taliban from waiting for the United States to leave and then pushing on to Kabul?
I certainly think that there is a more than a strong strand within the Taliban leadership, within Taliban thinking, that believes they can win the war and that a full-on military push should be the main line of effort. If that strand prevails, it's going to be really hard to get a peace settlement because it won't be the Taliban's priority. I would say, though, that the main reason they have engaged in these talks is their uncertainty that they, in fact, could win this war on the battlefield. they do deep down know that Afghanistan has changed a lot, that there'd be huge resistance to an attempted Taliban takeover, and that to get to that takeover, even for those leaders who think it could happen, it lays on the other side of an intra-Afghan bloodbath that nobody wants, and that would leave them with an isolated state that is very hard to govern and that the world would shun by and large. And so that has at least led them to explore what can be achieved at the negotiating table. Is it possible to get most of what we want through this other means and avoid said bloodbath? That does not itself align what the Taliban want with what we, the Afghan government, others want. But this wouldn't be the first negotiation where the sides came in really far apart, each thinking they were going to get a 90-10 deal. And then as they talk and talk, new possibilities open, and they end up agreeing to something that might have been unthinkable at the outset. That's often what a successful peace process looks like.
It's not like the United States is disappearing. We still have aircraft carriers and other means to wage war in Afghanistan, should it come to that. It's not unreasonable to think the United States might find itself back in Afghanistan in some capacity should things go sideways after September.
Yeah, absolutely. There's already been some reporting about planning that might be happening for what's the U.S. counterterrorism or other presence, we say over the horizon, which basically just means outside the borders of Afghanistan in different forms. That's a powerful hedge. There's also just supporting the Afghan security forces, which are already doing virtually 100% of the fighting. That's a reality and has been for years now. It's well known in Afghanistan that for all the predictions that the communist government would fall after the Soviets withdrew, it didn't. With a weaker army than the Afghan state has today, it was surviving seemingly indefinitely because the Soviet Union was still giving money to ensure that the soldiers were paid. So they were doing relatively okay until the Soviet Union itself collapsed. And that was the death knell of that government. Now, I don't think anyone misses that government, but the analogy is clear. It's often much harder for the insurgent group to achieve its loftiest and occasionally delusional ambitions to take the whole thing when there's an intact government that does have its large, in this case, large base of support and a lot of foreign support that's invested in making sure the country doesn't collapse or fall to this really barbaric movement that has done so much harm to so many.
Let's wrap up with this. At the start of the podcast, I played some remarks President George H.W. Bush gave when the Soviets finally left Afghanistan. It was what he hoped for the country, but here we are in 2021, and the things Americans dislike about the Taliban or Afghan society, such as the treatment of women, are going to outlast our presence again. So what is the lesson of these past 20 years of trying to change Afghanistan for the better?
I do think that the uglier sides of religion that the Taliban exhibit are not unique to the Taliban in Afghanistan. They are absolutely a product of a larger strand of, in Afghanistan's case, rural religious ultra-conservatism that shaped them more than they shaped it, you know? I think your question about the lessons of this 20-year episode are the right ones. I'd say long ago, this country learned the lesson about the limits of our ability to achieve outcomes, build a new state in both Iraq and Afghanistan. Today, I think the real lesson to learn is how strong a tendency we have not to seek peace until it's all but too late. And that is true across conflicts. As I look back on the Afghan saga for the United States, most people will say the single biggest mistake we made in Afghanistan was to exclude the Taliban from the new system after 2001. They were surrendering en masse and suing for peace. Many of those who surrendered ended up in Guantanamo or otherwise rejected from the new order. And that was the core that formed the insurgency that bedeviled us for so long.
That's an issue of language, correct? I mean, when you've described people as terrorists, they are automatically excluded from participating in what you're trying to set up after.
I mean, that's part of it. It's certainly politically hard to include the losers, especially when the losers have a lot of blood on their hands, which was true in both of these conflicts. But looking back, I mean, we could have achieved an almost unimaginably good peace settlement in 2001, 2003, 2005. We could have still achieved a much better one in 2010, 11, 12, when our military leverage was enormous. today, I still think peace is possible, and more than possible. Like, there's a reason I've given all these years of my life to trying to help. But the Taliban are vastly stronger now and are driving a much harder bargain. And that's just a reality that is not going to change anytime soon. So as I look to the future, to future conflicts, I hope that we have a kind of deep well of political courage to seek peaceful ends to these conflicts when it's early, and not give in to this impulse that we can just pound an adversary militarily into complete submission, because most of the time they will continue to exist, and we will wish that we had sought peace earlier.
Johnny Walsh, you've given us a lot to think about today. Thank you for sharing your knowledge of this complex situation. It could be that in Afghanistan, there are no good outcomes. On the next episode of History as It Happens, the Soviet debacle in Afghanistan was one of the closing chapters of the Cold War. Yes, the Cold War ended 30 years ago in 1991 when the USSR dissolved. We know who lost, but did the United States actually win? A reassessment of the post-Cold War world, next as we report History as It Happens, a podcast from the Washington Times.